Hi, I'm Hannah Carnegy, and I'll be a lecturer in the philosophy department at York from September. As a political philosopher, a lot of my work engages with the idea of individual liberties, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about here, and the concept of curtailing individual liberty for the common good with lockdown measures under the current pandemic. So, of course, many governments across the world have responded to the current pandemic by implementing lockdown measures that quite drastically curtail individual liberties. And many of us, philosophers included, and in particular philosophers in the liberal tradition, tend to think of liberty as a particularly important and fundamental right. So when the state imposes limits on our freedom, we think it really must only do so when it has very strong reasons to justify those measures that it's taking. So a question we can ask is, can lockdown measures be justified as a response to the current pandemic? If so, how can they be justified? And following on from that, how can some of the reasons that we can appeal to that might justify these limits on our freedom, how might some of those reasons help us think through difficult questions that arise with in relation to specific liberties, such as the right to protest? So I'm going to talk through two broad ways of thinking about reasons that might justify curtailing individual liberty. One is by appeal to the importance of protecting some common good, and the second is by reference to something called the harm principle. So starting with this idea of curtailing liberty for the common good, what does that mean exactly when what do philosophers mean when we talk about something as the common good? Well, philosophers often think of a common good as something that we provide to everyone by virtue of the fact that we stand in certain relations to one another and we share some common interests. And because these interests are sort of shared in common, we have an obligation to make sure that they are protected or fulfilled for everyone. So to put this in concrete terms, thinking about the pandemic, can we perhaps think of the importance of protecting the NHS, the National Health Service, as protecting an important element of the common good? So if we look to some of the government messaging around the start of the lockdown, you can see here one of the signs that they presented was asking us to stay home, protect the NHS, and save lives. And much of the political rhetoric was around the importance of protecting the NHS from being overwhelmed and from the pandemic causing the capacity of the NHS to be overcome. So the rhetoric was very much around flattening the curve to ensure that the NHS wasn't overwhelmed, so that there would be enough hospital beds, in particular ICU beds and ventilators for anyone who might need it. So we can maybe think of that imperative of protecting the NHS as being an appeal to the common good, and to say, look, it's really important that we limit individual liberty in order to protect this important common good. So perhaps as co-citizens, we have a shared or common interest in having access to healthcare and good public health, and that gives us an obligation to provide and uphold a robust public health system. So that might be one way of justifying the way in which the lockdown measures limit individual freedom by reference to the importance of protecting the NHS as a common good. Of course, there are some problems with that approach. So you might well be thinking, well, what is it exactly to share a common interest, and how might we weigh that idea of a common interest against the interests of individuals in their own liberty? So you might be thinking, well, what if I value my individual liberty above, say, my health or my access to healthcare? That's to say, you might be skeptical of the idea that we can ever really sort of subordinate people's liberty, or that people's liberty can be outweighed for the sake of some common good. And you might be worried that actually that amounts to placing sacrifices on some people for the benefit of others, given that appeals to the common good might always involve some controversial statements about the ways in which we value things in common in societies where there might be reasonable disagreement over what constitutes a common good. Okay, so moving on then to the harm principle. A common way of thinking about the limits to individual liberty, even and perhaps especially among philosophers who really value individual liberty as basic, is to think that individual liberty is delimited by the harm principle. And the harm principle was made most famous perhaps by John Stuart Mill. And the idea behind it is that the only reason to interfere with a person's liberty is to protect others from harm. So the idea being that individual liberty means that I'm free to engage in any actions that are self-regarding, that concern myself primarily, but it doesn't, my liberty does not extend to causing harm to others. So you might have heard this idea that, you know, my right to wave my fist around stops where your nose begins. And so thinking about the pandemic and coronavirus, given that people may be able to transmit the virus to others, even when they don't have symptoms, they're not aware of carrying the virus, it seems pretty clear that each of us poses a relatively high risk of causing harm to others just by standing in proximity to them. So from that perspective, the harm principle could provide pretty strong justification for placing even very strict limits on individual freedom as a response to this current pandemic. So we could think of this as meaning that, well, at the moment, my liberty to move my body now only extends as far as your 2-meter bubble or something because of the risk of harm that I pose to you in potentially transmitting the virus to you. Now, even though that provides a pretty strong justification for at least temporary lockdown measures while this risk exists, there's a difficulty in that the harm principle doesn't really provide a super clear distinction under conditions of risk and uncertainty. So what I mean by this is that it's not, you know, it's certainly not the case that necessarily every time I get close to someone, I will infect them with the virus, I will cause harm to them. But of course, when there is uncertainty over who carries the virus, who might be transmitting it, there's always going to be some risk that any of us could pass it on, causing that harm. So under conditions of risk and uncertainty, viewed in that way, it seems like we just have to find some way of setting rules to manage that risk at a public level to acceptable levels. And you might think, oh, actually, we already do this kind of acceptable risk setting in various contexts. So an example might be variable speed limits on motorways, where we might set a different speed limit at any given time, depending on the level of congestion or the weather conditions. And so we might set a speed according to the current conditions that we think can be justified as a safe speed to drive at, that keeps that risk of causing collisions and harm to others at an acceptable level. So maybe in that vein, we can think of managing the lockdown along similar lines. So we may need to ease and tighten social distancing measures accordingly as the R number and the risk of transmission fluctuates. So even the harm principle could perhaps give us some kind of guidance on how to do that variably, depending on where we set the acceptable level of risk. The thing about that is we would need to find some sort of presumably democratically acceptable way of setting public standards for that risk. Okay, having covered those two broad approaches, or those two broad types of reasons that we might appeal to justify lockdown measures, you might be thinking at this point, okay, how does that help us tackle more specific questions we have relating to perhaps specific liberties and rights and exerting those under lockdown? So particularly pertinent at the moment, what about protesting during lockdown? So during this pandemic, we've seen Black Lives Matter protests organized across the world, including in many cities that have current lockdown measures that restrict public gatherings. And of course, this has raised questions about the ethics of protesting under such lockdown measures. But if we think now about how appealing to reasons based in the common good or how appealing to the harm principle can be invoked to justify reasons for implementing lockdown, that might also help us to think through the importance of the freedom to protest under similar conditions. So thinking of the common good, if part of the justification for lockdown measures can be made by appeal to the common good of protecting the public health system, there may well be other important elements of the common good that bear on the importance of protesting. So, for example, where public institutions such as policing and the justice system are beset by systemic racism, then we may well be able to appeal to reasons based in the urgency of reforming these institutions that speak in favour of protesting by appealing to the importance of reforming these systems as an important element of the common good. So in a sense, we can see that similar reasons of appealing to the common good might speak in favour of protesting, even where common good-based reasons also justify some elements of lockdown. And then along similar lines, thinking about the harm principle, we could possibly think of the importance of rights against harm as also providing reasons in favour of protesting against harm suffered as a result of institutional racism. And these reasons might be especially pressing where that harm is inflicted by the very institutions that are tasked with enforcing lockdown measures, such as the police and justice system. So in that way, I think we can see how thinking about the common good and the harm principle can help us to consider the balance of reasons that might apply to the right to protest, even in a pandemic where certain restrictions on liberty may also be justified. So very finally, to sum up, I've mainly been talking about liberty as protected by interference from the state or possible justifications for the state placing limits on individual liberty. As lockdown restrictions begin to ease and businesses are allowed to open up again, of course, there will be fewer state limits on our individual liberties. But this may raise questions about the importance of having the freedom to make certain life choices for ourselves. People who are required by an employer to go back to work, for example, and are dependent on those wages, may have no choice but to go back and work in conditions that they may not feel particularly safe in or may expose them to a higher risk of catching the virus. So that's to say, we may well have worries about freedom stemming from the social and economic conditions that restrict a person's freedom to make important life choices, even if those are not limits imposed by the state. Now, to go fully into all the different conceptions of freedom that one might have would be a whole nother lecture. But I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's given you some perspectives, some philosophical perspectives that we can bring to bear on how to think of justifications for lockdown restrictions under the current pandemic and how those philosophical perspectives might help us to tackle difficult questions. If you've enjoyed this video, do also go and check out some of the other videos made by my colleagues at York. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to maybe see some of you soon. Bye.